You've chosen Extemp as your event. Now it's time to learn the fundamentals, how to research and craft a thesis. This is the first step on your Extemp journey, and our goal for this lesson is to learn how to go from a confusing question to a clear, confident, and well-supported argument. So the first step is deconstructing the question and thinking about it. So before you even type a word into a search engine, you want to understand what the question that you have pulled is truly asking. And you don't just want to read it, you really want to dissect it. So I've broken this down into 4 stages. First, you want to identify the question type. What kind of answer does it demand based on the question that you've gotten? And there's different types of questions. Some questions will ask you for a yes or no answer. Some will ask you to articulate why. Some will ask you to articulate how. And so each of those have a different structure. Yes and no might be a question like, will sanctions be effective? That's asking you to take a clear position, either yes, they will or no, they won't. A why question, like why has polarization intensified, asks you to explain causes to some phenomenon going on. And obviously a how question, like how can the United Nations better address the global refugee crisis? Your job there would be to propose and justify a series of solutions or steps. I know it sounds obvious, but just thinking critically about what is the question asking and what am I going to have to do to answer the question is a basic and fundamental step that you need to start with. Then these next 2 steps, I think, really will allow you to get depth with your response. And so the second step I recommend is to find the core tension at the heart of the question. You need to be asking yourself, the Extemp question is chosen for some reason, and that's because there isn't an easy answer. There's typically some sort of tension at the heart of this issue that has made it a relevant question today. So for instance, if we're asking a question about will the new trade sanctions on Russia be effective, the tension is probably between the intent of sanctions, which is to punish, and the reality of global economics, meaning Russia's resilience or other trade partners stepping in. And so that means that's the tension that you're going to have to be addressing. And I think another way of thinking about that is this third step, which is about determining the question's relevancy. And the core question here is, why is this question particularly relevant and important now? Every Extemp prompt comes from a headline or ongoing issue that's been in the news recently, and so the judge or the audience expects you to connect your answer to that immediate context, not just give a timeless, generic analysis. So to do that, you're going to have to research and understand what's happening in the weeks or months or even days leading up to the tournament. So for example, if the question is something like, how can the US compete with China for influence in Africa? You can't just give vague, generic subpoint responses that articulate ideas that might be good for the US being able to compete with China for influence in Africa. You would need to know something specific, like just 3 weeks ago, China hosted the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, or maybe they signed a new Belt and Road deal in Africa. That's what makes the question urgent. There was something that prompted this. If the question is, can Biden win the re-election? Imagine this was back in 2024. You would want to tie it to that week's polling numbers or that week's fundraising numbers or that week's recent primary results, something like that. So by grounding your answer in the most recent developments, you show the judge that you're not just giving a canned history lecture, you're responding to the world as it is today. And finally, you may need to define key terms. If you get a question like, can Biden win re-election? Not really a lot of terms to define. But if there is a question like, what about effective sanctions, you might need to decide what effective means. Or maybe there's a term in there that judges might not exactly know what it entails. So does effective sanctions mean crippling Russia's economy? Does it mean changing its political behavior? Does it mean simply isolating it? Your definition will shape your entire argument. So sometimes you do have to articulate that clearly. So that's all just analyzing the question. Step 2 is obviously researching it. And I think there's 2 tiers to researching. The first is everything you do before a tournament. And obviously there is what you do during that limited prep time, the 30 minutes you get to prepare your speech. Let's talk about what happens before a tournament. I think important mindset to have is you chose Extemp because you wanted to become an expert in current affairs. Part of that means regularly consuming the news and researching topics in greater depth to have a better understanding. Now, right now, when you pull a question, you're probably going to feel really overwhelmed because you're going to be getting topics that you do not know a lot about. And the prospect of being able to create, craft, and execute on a really good speech with argumentative depth in only 30 minutes is probably going to feel overwhelming. But the whole goal of Extemp is you are building fundamental skills. And not only are you building the skill of how to construct a speech and deliver it fluently with only 30 minutes of prep, you're also developing the skill of becoming more well versed on current affairs. And so that means daily. You want to be reading all of these well qualified, credible publications. You want to be listening to podcasts so that when you pull a question, you're not starting from scratch. That's worst case is you get a question, you know absolutely nothing about the topic, and now you need to try to figure it out with only 30 minutes. The goal is that by the time you pull a question, you already know a lot about that topic, and now all you need to do is find the sources for that particular speech in the moment, as opposed to actually having to learn about that topic in those 30 minutes as well. So you need to make it a goal. You need to think of it as training a muscle, right? If you know by the end of the semester you need to run a 6-minute mile, you can't just sit around and wait and hope that in the final week before you have to run that mile time that you can just cram and get it done. That's not how growing muscles work. It's the same thing for becoming an expert in current affairs. You need to daily practice this skill by reading news articles, by listening to podcasts. And so I'm going to give you all a link to a list of publications and podcasts. The one that you see here is just like a very, very, very brief list, but I'm trying to give you the type of flavor of news sources that you should be looking to. This shouldn't be, Google News, really clickbaity headlines with like tons of pop-up ads going everywhere. We will be able to give you access to a lot of these publications that are behind paywalls, but it's important that you're reading qualified and credible publications to gain a depth of understanding. The bottom line is just the more you understand about the world, what's going on, and most importantly, why those events are happening, the easier it will be for you to have something meaningful to say at a tournament. And I really do want to encourage you to listen to podcasts. I think it's really tempting as an extemper to only just read the credible news publications, the ones that people would expect, right? Like New York Times, Washington Post, The Economist, BBC, Al Jazeera. But I think it's really useful to listen to longer form podcasts because typically in those podcasts, they go beyond just the headline of what is going on that particular day. And they actually dive deeper into the reasons why that event is occurring. They'll be interviewing experts. It'll be longer form. And I just find listening to a conversation ends up sticking in my memory a lot more. And I end up getting way more argumentative depth if I listen to like a 20 to 30 minute podcast on an issue as opposed to just reading a quick 2-minute article. So that's, I think, a huge way to level up your skills as an extemper. And I usually try to stack listening to podcasts to other activities I do. Like when I'm getting ready in the morning and I'm eating my breakfast, I'll listen to the New York Times daily. If in the evening, as I'm kind of cooling down, maybe I'll play a video game, maybe I'll be cleaning up, something like that, I might listen to the Ezra Klein Show. And so those types of podcasts, if you can stack them with other things you're doing, but still be paying meaningful attention, I think it's a good way to, again, be growing in terms of your knowledge acquisition of what's going on in the world. So that's my big advice there. Again, I'm going to link you all a resource of giving you a much more comprehensive list of publications that you can kind of look at. And I know what the extempers really recommend is that before a tournament, you begin to create groupings based on different topic areas of what's going on in the world. So for instance, you might create, if you're a national extemper, you might create a kind of grouping in your notes of everything that's going on in terms of domestic politics, like elections and things like that. And you might just be like taking notes and collecting articles there. And then you might also have a section on the economy and you start to track all of the developments that are going on in the economy. Then you might create a section on like science and technology and the developments there. Typically before a tournament, you will be told what the topics of each round are going to be. So it'll be like round 1 will be politics, round 2 will be the economy, round 3 will be science and technology. And same in international extemp, you might get like round 1's going to be Europe, round 2 is going to be Asia, round 3 is going to be the Middle East. And so you know that you can kind of track what's going on there. The bottom line is the more research you do before a tournament, the better prepared you'll be. Now, during your prep time, it's going to be very different, right? Ideally, you have a lot of understanding and a lot of depth about world affairs so that when you go into that prep time and you pull the question, you don't have to figure out what's going on with the topic. Instead, the prep time should be focused on executing the high-speed information gathering. So you're obviously going to conduct a broad scan with simple search terms, probably on Google. You're going to try to find 5 to 7 promising articles from reputable sources. You're going to be speed reading for potential answers and supporting data. And you're going to want to start collecting evidence, right? You're going to want to find the key statistics, the key expert opinions, the key warrants that you're going to use in your speech to deploy evidence effectively. The key point right now is at this phase, as you're just quickly trying to find information before you've even crafted a thesis, the key point that you want to kind of come to is like, hey, are experts leaning one way or another? Do you see a compelling argument that you can adopt? And then, of course, you're going to want to be trying to find different topic areas that can turn into your subpoints. So as you're doing that, I mean, it's a kind of iterative process, right? Probably, if you pull the question, you probably already have some ideas about the topic. If you've been doing the first step of researching before the tournament effectively, you probably already know in general which way you'd probably lean on the question, but you're still finding articles, making sure that experts kind of support you. And then you're sort of thinking about, all right, how do I group these into 3 subpoints? How do I think about like what the overarching or umbrella reason is that unifies everything together? And then you're going to move on from there. But the key point is you're moving quickly. You are scanning, you are finding articles, you're finding those key stats, and you're just collecting that in a very quick amount of time so that you can move to this step, which is forming your thesis. So what are you looking for? You're looking for an answer to the question. And it's important that you make a decision about how you answer the question. I know that sounds very obvious, but sometimes extempers are a little bit timid, or they try to hedge their responses. They try to give a response like, it's complicated, and that is almost never effective. You want a strong, debatable thesis, and that's always better than a weak or non-committal one, even if it's debatable. Like, the whole point of an extemp is you are giving a hot take, and you're going to be defending it. So lean into that hot take. And you obviously want to be finding 3 topic areas that are, or reasons that you're going to turn into your subpoints to organize the speech. So for instance, imagine it's 2024. Let's say it's like, the summer before Biden dropped out. And it's like, the question is, will Democrats lose the 2024 election? Imagine you're just scanning on Google. You're probably going to find lots of evidence saying that their election chances aren't looking good. Now you want to try to find the core driving reasons why that's true. And you might find a bunch of articles talking about how Americans feel in terms of the Democrats' handling of the economy or inflation. So, all right, you start to create a grouping there. Maybe you find a bunch of articles talking about Biden's age, or if it's after he's dropped out, him leaving the election too late. And then third, maybe you find a grouping of articles talking about how Americans feel Democrats are mishandling international affairs and global crises like the Ukraine war and what's going on in Israel and Palestine. And so that's where you can kind of start to create your overall thesis and kind of brainstorm it. And the important thing as well is, as you're trying to identify those 3 disparate subpoints, that you don't just answer the question with like a yes, no, and then 3 subpoints, but you're starting to think about finding a unifying theme that connects all of your evidence together. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment in a little bit more depth. But I think key point for right now is the best extempers create a cohesive argument as opposed to just a grab bag list where it feels like the 3 subpoints are so disconnected and disparate that they really have nothing to do with each other. One final point I want to make about the subpoints is it's really, really important that you are finding distinct categories. A big mistake I see novice extempers make is they get 3 subpoints that functionally are really overlapping. They're not really that different. They might be phrased a little bit differently, but once you think about it logically, you're like, this is the exact same argument. Or maybe they're slightly different, but overall, like, there's a huge overlap on them on the Venn diagram. And I think a good test to do is what I would call the separation test, which is just like, could evidence from subpoint 1 be used for subpoint 2? If the answer is yes, your points are too similar, right? None of your evidence from a body paragraph or a subpoint should be applicable to a different body paragraph, even though they are all going to be connected by a larger unified thesis. I think that's really important because if your subpoints are overlapping, it's just going to start to get really boring from an audience perspective. We're going to feel like you're just repeating yourself. All right, let's talk about the umbrella thesis, because this is how you elevate your extemp speech from a mid-level or just kind of like very boring or dry take to something that has much more argumentative depth. And so you can see here the basic structure, right? You say yes, no, you have your answer or the reason why, because, subpoint 1, 2, and 3. That's kind of going to be the structure of every single extemp. You always have your 3 subpoints. You always have your answer. But I think this is the secret sauce of the Bellarmine method. Is rather than just a simple yes or no to the question, you should be thinking about what an underlying unifying theme is that ties together all the subpoints that you're finding. And I think the best extempers don't just provide a simplistic answer to the question and then provide it through 3 disparate and unrelated subpoints. Instead, they show that there's a unified point that connects everything in their thesis together. And that's what I like to call the umbrella thesis. It's a thesis that pulls the three reasons under one overarching theme so that it doesn't feel like that grab bag list that I was talking about. So let's look at some examples because I think this is really, really important. So let's say your question is the US under authoritarian rule? Let's say you can see your response here. It's like, yes, Trump has dismantled the powers of core democratic institutions. Notice that is the umbrella. You're not just saying yes for three reasons, 1, 2, 3. You're saying yes. Here's my overarching response to it. The umbrella is that the core democratic institutions have been dismantled in three ways. First, by usurping Congress's constitutional authority. Second, by undermining the independence of the courts. And third, by harming the free speech of the press. So notice that there's that umbrella concept of dismantling democratic institutions that unifies all of the points. And so that's much better than just saying this thesis is yes because of subpoint 1, 2, and 3. And you can see that on the right as well. How can the U.S. compete with China for influence in Africa? And look at this thesis. It would say the U.S. can compete by offering what Beijing cannot. Partnerships that empower rather than entrap African nations. And then there's three ways that we would do this. First, through providing sustainable infrastructure that avoids debt traps. Second, strengthening democratic institutions that resist authoritarian influence. And third, leveraging private sector innovation to create long-term prosperity. This is so much more interesting than if you just said the U.S. can compete with China in Africa in three ways. First, through infrastructure. Second, through strengthening institutions. And third, through private sector innovation. That's so vague. Notice that this version of the thesis has gotten us to a much more interesting place of creating depth, that there is that fundamentally what China is doing in Africa could be seen as entrapment, as limiting their ability to grow or to be free, rather than the US, which could empower nations. And so that's just like a much more interesting thesis. So that's what you want to do. This is how you get like that really stellar version of a thesis that's going to stand out. And so I know this is going to feel hard at first, but just know that if you give us a thesis without that umbrella, that will not be meeting our standards. If you give us subpoints that aren't really developed into reasons, that also won't be meeting our standards. So let's talk about that part, which is transforming subpoints from just vague topics, which is a classic novice mistake I see all the time, into actually developed reasons. So, what is a topic? What is a reason? A topic is simply a category or noun, like it tells the audience or the judge what you're going to talk about, but it doesn't make an argument. So the classic example of this is just, a freshman extemper stands up and says, the first way, whatever the question is, or like the first reason why the Democrats will lose the election is the economy. And that's just like so vague. It doesn't make an argument. It's just like a vague category or noun. What about the economy? Why is the economy a reason why Democrats are going to lose? Spell it out. Turn it into a reason. And so a reason is a causal explanation. It creates a cause and effect. It's a mechanism. It's a verb. It's an action. It explains how or why something is happening and directly supports the thesis. And this is more than just a vocabulary trick. It's literally a fundamental shift in persuasion. A topic is passive, whereas a reason is active, and it shows that you understand the forces at play. So let's look at this example on the right. It says, is the U.S. under authoritarian rule? You can imagine, look at this weak example. This is what I see from novices all the time, and so I really want to push you to go beyond this if you want to really stand out as an extemper. So the weak example is, yes, the U.S. is under authoritarian rule, as seen through 1, Congress, 2, the courts, and 3, the press. Now, from this, I have like a vague sense of what you're doing, but notice it sounds cliche, it sounds underdeveloped, it's so vague. I'm not interested. But look at this stronger version. Yes, because Trump has dismantled the powers of core democratic institutions in 3 ways. First, by usurping Congress's constitutional authority. Second, by undermining the independence of the courts. And 3, by harming the free speech of the press. You can see how much more developed that second example is. And it's not just about adding more words, it's about changing it argumentatively. It's making sure that there's that umbrella thesis that has the overarching umbrella reason why your thesis is correct, along with 3 developed subpoints that provide lines of reasoning to back up your points. Let's finally talk about some common mistakes that we want to avoid. I think I've talked about a good number of them already, but some other ones are definitely like vague statements that lack specificity. I've already been touching on this, but oftentimes I might see freshmen try to do an umbrella thesis, but they would say something like, let's look at this first one. Is it accurate to say that the U.S. is under authoritarian rule? They said yes, because of 3 troubling developments. It's not really an umbrella thesis. Obviously, it's super vague. What are the developments? Let's look at this next one. Then the second one says, how can the British government improve their stagnating economy? By implementing 3 economic policies. It's like, well, duh, that's exactly what you would need to improve an economy, but what are those going to be? So I think those are the types of mistakes I see. Another example, and meant to be the second sub point here, I accidentally copy and pasted the authoritarian rule one twice, is how can the U.S. compete with China for influence in Africa? And you can imagine a novice saying, by helping African nations. And it's just that doesn't have specificity at all. So watch out, even as you try to carve an umbrella thesis, that you don't just say something so vague that is fundamentally saying nothing at all. Another way to think about a mistake is, or a common mistake I see is having weak verbs that don't really show action. And this is, I think, just the other side of the same coin of making sure you have strong reasons. But I think oftentimes freshmen rely on the to be verb of is. I'm sure you've heard this in your English 1 class. And the reason that to be verbs end up not being very effective is because you use them as a substitute or a crutch to not really think about what the core action or what the core reason is. So when you say the first point is Congress, or the first point is about Congress, well, what about Congress is going on? What is the action going on? What is the mechanism? What is the cause? What is the effect? I don't know. And so if you change that to Trump is usurping Congress's constitutional powers, that becomes a lot more interesting. So once you start using words like usurping, eroding, leveraging, accelerating, stifling, bolstering, undermining, now you're doing more heavy lifting. And again, this isn't just use a thesaurus and find a different verb. This is about thinking critically about what is going on here, what is the action that is driving these forces in the world, and that becomes a lot more interesting. One other mistake that I haven't really mentioned yet is a lack of parallel structure, and that's when the phrasing of your subpoints don't line up grammatically or stylistically, and it just makes you sound very clunky. Look at this example. It says, the U.S. can compete by investing in infrastructure, it must support democracy, and private sector innovation is important. They don't flow, they're not grammatically or stylistically the same, versus the stronger one, which is the U.S. can compete by 1, investing in infrastructure, 2, supporting democracy, and 3, promoting private sector innovation. So if all of your subpoints begin with a gerund, like a verb ending in ing, then, or if your first one does, then your next 2 should, right? So if you say investing, supporting, promoting, those are the same grammatical structure. And it makes your sentence more elegant, rhythmic, and easier to remember. And just always know, audiences latch onto patterns, and when the form is parallel, it just sticks in their head better. So, in summary, I think key takeaways, building your thesis muscle. You're obviously going to have to learn how to deconstruct a question. I think that will be pretty easy, but obviously the harder part of deconstructing the question requires the second part, which is staying current, just learning more and more about how the world works, why the world is the way it is, what's going on in the world, why those events are occurring. And the more that you can do that, the more that you'll be able to deconstruct questions in a meaningful way, because you'll go beyond the surface level headlines and you'll be thinking about, well, what are the core tensions at play here? Right? Why is this question so important and relevant now? And that will just help you to set up your entire Extemp in a way better way. And then we obviously talked about how to create a strong umbrella thesis, as well as how to use reasons as opposed to topics for your subpoints. I think it's really important that those last 2 pieces here, the umbrella thesis and reasons instead of topics, you study them. We will definitely be assessing your ability to see whether or not you can really differentiate a very strong Extemp thesis from a weak one, and then be able to implement that on your own Extemps. So hopefully this was informative. Best of luck.